An Asian family is traveling in their station wagon. A young Eve is seen in the backseat. Her parents talk to her about going on a vacation to Asia. She is uninterested in going there, so they try to hype up the place by saying that it has a great zoo and food. They joke around in the car and have a good family time. Meanwhile, her father receives a beep on his pager. As he looks down to unbuckle his pager from his belt, a car rams into his wagon from the driver's side, instantly ending both of the parents and fatally wounding little Eve. She is found and stabilized by the paramedics and placed in a foster home. 20 years go by, and we see a black sedan roll up to a visually spectacular house. A grown-up Eve gets out from the back, accompanied by her husband, the wealthy Tom Stewart, and their dog, Bully. Tom is the owner of Blake House, an old manor which was abandoned by him because he moved overseas for work, where he met and married Eve. Now, Tom has returned to the States to have a closer grip on his family business and further expand it. As they enter the house, Bully wanders off inside. This causes Eve to follow and call out for him. Eventually, she stumbles into the attic of the house. It is an old, dusty place, with things such as an old parrot cage, a wooden rocking horse, and dated furniture. She calls out to Bully, and upon receiving no response, goes deeper into the attic. She pauses to look at something, and is startled by an unknown man switching on the attic lights. The man introduces himself as Sanders, the family's caretaker. He asks Eve what she was doing there, and she tells him she was looking for Bully. Bully is comfortably napping on a rug in the attic's corner. Eve picks him up and proceeds downstairs. Tom walks into the house and is met by Sanders, who is delighted to see him and congratulates him on his marriage. Tom commends the good shape of the house, only to find that his old house help, Mrs. Menabar, is still there and helps keep the house tidy. On the other hand, Eve finds an old book on the shelf, with weird scribblings on it indicating Tom's first wife. She shrugs it off and joins Tom and Sanders, where they both are formally introduced. Sanders takes his leave as night falls. Eve and Tom prepare to sleep, and she asks if this is the same room Tom used to sleep with his first wife. Tom answers in denial, and gives Eve a kiss goodnight before going to sleep. When the couple is fast asleep, the door creaks open fully, and a moving shadow is seen in the doorsill. Early next morning, Eve wakes up to find Tom gone. He left a note saying that he has joined Sanders into town and will be back before dinner. Eve gets up and decides to go to the nearby town in order to get groceries for dinner. She wants to take Bully for a walk as well, but the dog wouldn't budge, so she ends up going alone. She arrives at a store and is greeted by an old lady who asks her if she needs any assistance. Eve declines. The old lady tries to make small talk to learn where Eve is residing. Eve reveals that she lives at Blake House. Upon learning this, the old lady is puzzled and scurries away like a scared mouse. Eve finalizes her groceries and leaves. As she approaches the house, an extremely well put together, monotone lady awaits her. She is introduced as Mrs. Menabar, the house's caretaker. Mrs. Menabar and Eve introduce themselves to each other and get to work preparing dinner for the evening. As night falls, they lay out the dinner table and Mrs. Menabar leaves. When Eve inquires if she wants to meet Tom, Mrs. Menabar evades the question and walks away. Tom arrives, tired from work and hungry. He hastily goes towards the dining hall to sit down but comes to an awkward halt. The reason for his halt is the crockery set on the dining table. It is his wedding china. Tom is somewhat disgusted and leaves the dining room, only to be seen eating with Eve sometime later in the kitchen. There, he compliments the food and reveals that moving back to the house has taken a toll on him. And seeing the dining hall all laid out like that made him relive the moments he spent with his first wife. Upon learning about the crockery set, Eve tells him that Mrs. Menabar did not mention anything about it being his wedding china. Tom shuts down this conversation before telling Eve that due to him being overseas, the company's finances have been a mess. He further says that he will have to go to town every day for the following few weeks, and hopes that Eve understands. As the night takes its turn, Tom and Eve are shown having passionate. The attic echoes with their moaning. In a moment of intense climax, the door of the room creaks open. This startled both of them, and Eve thinks that an intruder is present in the house. Tom gets up to find Bully sitting behind the door, and shrugs before going back to bed. He apologizes to Eve for not giving her enough time, and Eve tells him that it is okay, before letting Tom know that she has stopped taking her birth control pills and is ready to welcome a baby Stewart. Tom kisses her and she goes to sleep on Tom's chest. Visuals of a calm ocean surface are shown, before cutting back to Blake House, where the sun has risen and Tom has left for town. Eve pins her recipes onto a clipboard in the room by the kitchen, and Mrs. Menabar creeps up to her, asking if Eve wants some tea. With a quiet gasp, Eve looks behind and smiles, before taking the tray from Mrs. Menabar and setting it down on the table. Eve states that she is working on a cookbook and wants to publish it. She sits down, infuses the tea and then drinks it, only to be disturbed by the bell. It is the moving company. Her and Tom's stuff has arrived. She directs the movers to the sitting room and advises Mrs. Menabar to leave everything as it is and not to bother with the stuff before going to town, as she has a train to catch. In town, Eve sits on a bench beside the rail tracks. She is approached by a frail old lady who greets her and welcomes her to town. She sits beside Eve and tells her Susan Gummerby, the woman Eve met earlier at the store, told her about Eve being Tom's second wife. Eve has a conversation with the old lady where she finds out that Tom's first wife was an old, lonely lady known as Ms. Blake, and that everything Tom has is his wife's inheritance. He was supposed to be the one who would carry the wealthy Blake family's legacy. The old lady antagonizes Eve by asking weird unhinged questions and gets up to leave. She tells Eve to enjoy her stay and walks off into the background. Horns blare and the train arrives, and the day cuts to the next. Eve wakes up and finds her underwear unpacked and kept in the top drawers of the dresser, something she told Mrs. Menabar not to do. She walks into the kitchen, wishes Mrs. Menabar a good morning, and asks about the cargo being unpacked. Mrs. Menabar reassures Eve that she vividly remembers Eve telling her to unpack and put the stuff in appropriate places. Eve is somewhat confused, but all she does is give Eve a stoic look. Mrs. Menabar then suggests that they get straight to preparing dinner, as guests are expected in the night. Night falls and Tom arrives to help Eve in the kitchen. He jokes around and helps set up the dinner table. The doorbell rings. Sanders has arrived at the Blake house with an uninvited guest, Wendy, whose unexpected appearance shocks Tom. While eating, they have a conversation about Eve's background, and the viewers learn that Tom's parents also perished in a car accident, bearing striking resemblance to Eve's parents' demise. Wendy walks into the kitchen with a glass of wine in her hand, and Eve is already there, cleaning up the dishes. She asks if Eve has any house help, and upon learning of Mrs. Menabar, she reveals that she was sure she had heard Mrs. Menabar had perished. Mrs. Menabar used to work for Wendy's elder sister, who had the woman wrapped around her finger. This revelation puzzles Eve, but she does not think too much of it, as Wendy is a snotty, high-strung woman. Wendy tells Eve that Tom's first wife was her sister. Wendy and Tom met in college and fell madly in love with each other. Wendy's older sister snatched Tom from her. All of it culminated in Tom marrying Wendy's sister and inheriting the Blake family estate, leaving Wendy to mourn the loss of her love. But sometime after her demise, Tom approached Wendy and found solace and comfort within her, indicating that they had repeated sexual encounters. During this conversation, Wendy is drinking wine and gets too drunk. She starts slurring her words and acting odd. Wendy spent her whole life living at Blake House, and her sister left it to Tom in the next of his blood. If her sister could know that Tom and Eve had married, she would murder Eve, as according to Wendy, she was a very jealous and possessive woman who loved Tom to the greatest extent. Eve gives Wendy an awkward smirk and brings the dessert out to the dinner table, where Tom and Sanders are waiting. At the table, Wendy starts embarrassing Tom by telling their intimate stories in front of Eve and Sanders. Tom eyes her down, but she does not stop uttering absurd details. The final nail in the coffin is when Wendy accuses Tom of enjoying Eve and her young skin. This is enough to push Tom over the edge, and he shouts at Wendy to shut up. All of a sudden, the shameless smile on Wendy's face turns into absolute horror. She leans back and gasps loudly, forcing Tom and Sanders to rush by her side. She takes a few deep breaths, which cause the pearl necklace on her neck to break and scatter, revealing she choked on some dessert. Wendy proceeds to drink some more and leaves. Before bed, Tom and Eve have an altercation where Eve accuses Tom of lying and keeping her in the dark, as Tom told Eve that Wendy was her sister. Tom profusely apologizes to Eve and they reconcile before going to bed. Mrs. Menabar is cleaning the kitchen the next day when Eve arrives. They greet each other and Mrs. Menabar hands Eve a cup of tea. Eve inquires about Tom's first wife. Menabar pauses for a split second, and then begins to tell the story of Tom Stewart and his unnamed older bride. Tom and her lusted for each other. They would spend every minute of their time together, boating, traveling, and throwing parties. Tom loved her, and so did she. She was a very caring, kind, and full of life woman who was the center of the universe for everyone around her. But things changed when she fell sick. Tom was never the same. He distanced himself from her and blamed himself for not being able to do enough to prevent her demise. She then met a terrible end, having no self-identity and having lost her mind. Eve takes a shower to wash away all the negative energy she has built up listening to all the erratic conversations from the night before. Suddenly, Eve's ears start ringing with a deafening ring, and she is forced to put her hand against the wall to gain balance. There is a loud knock on the door. Eve stabilizes herself and climbs out of the shower to meet Sanders at the door. She tells him to get comfortable while she puts on some clothes, and Sanders sets down a package at the doorside table. As Eve is drying her hair, she hears a conversation between Sanders and Menabar conspiring against her in the attic. She hastily rushes to the attic to find Sanders swerving down the stairs in a hurry, flying right past her and leaving through the door. She tries to stop him, but Sanders ignores her and rushes right out. As Eve lowers her gaze to acknowledge the package from before, she is horrified to find that the package has disappeared. Eve races to the attic and looks out the attic window to find Sanders running towards his car, and a hand imprinted on the window's glass. She stumbles into the kitchen, with her ears still ringing with that excruciating magnitude from earlier. She finds Mrs. Menabar and asks if she saw Sanders. Mrs. Menabar ignores this question and inquires about Eve's well-being, as she has difficulty standing up due to dizziness and the persistent ringing noise. Mrs. Menabar points out that Margot, Tom's first wife, developed her illness exactly the same way. At first, it was dizziness, ringing, and vomiting, and later it escalated to psychotic breakdowns and hallucinations, all of it leading to her inevitable demise. As this conversation ends, Eve looks over her shoulder to find that Mrs. Menabar was never sitting beside her. Rather, she was standing near the stove preparing tea, and she responded in refusal to Eve's question of her seeing Sanders. This ordeal startles Eve, as she could swear she saw Sanders put that package on the table. After taking some well-needed rest, Eve decides to take a walk. Upon her lonely walk near the town's outskirts, she runs into Alice, the lady from the train station. Alice asks about Eve's health, After the small talk, Alice grabs Eve by the shoulders and begs her to not eat anything Tom cooks for her. She also repeatedly asks her to go to a doctor if she feels unwell at any point. All of this is rather peculiar for Eve, as the line between reality and imagination is now what can be called a visual blur. She remembers asking Menabar not to mess with her stuff, but Menabar not remembering it. It is also important to note that no one else has seen Menabar except Eve. That evening, Tom arrives early and is in the kitchen cooking something. He announces he has a surprise and unveils his famous Philly cheesesteaks with mushrooms. As he serves Eve a portion, she feels disheartened, remembering Alice's words, but takes a bite anyway. While they're sleeping, Eve shows interest in knowing about Margot's illness, and Tom tells her exactly the same things Menabar told her earlier. Later on at night, Eve gets up from sleep to throw up in the toilet. A dark figure passes by her, but she is oblivious to it. She goes back to sleep. Day by day, Eve starts delving deeper and deeper into mania. She is unable to differentiate her hallucinations from reality. She is unable to eat, sleep, or function. In the span of just a few days, she grows into a shell of her former self, with overgrown unkempt hair and severe dark circles. Marks of malnutrition appear over her face. She keeps hearing voices, telling her to do things, then stopping her from doing those things simultaneously. One dark day, she goes to find Alice. Stumbling upon Mrs. Gummerby, she finds out Alice's location, which is in a nearby library, where she volunteers. Eve travels to the library to seek Alice's help. She lays out her current condition in front of her and asks for help and for peace. Alice lends her the last book Margot Blake borrowed, as she believes reading that book will bring Eve closer to the truth. The book is a detailed encyclopedia on how to make poisons. Inside the book, a page is marked. The page walks through a detailed summary on how to construct a poison that will push the subject into severe trauma, mental breakdowns, hallucinations, and eventual demise. All of the dots start to connect, but Eve is still unsure, or rather she doesn't want to know. She rushes back home. There, she sees Sanders zooming past her, ignoring her when she calls out her name repeatedly. Mrs. Menabar has some papers in her hand. The papers are the Blake family's inheritance transfer papers. As the door opens, Menabar hides them behind a cushion. Eve has a minor breakdown where she questions whether Tom has ever loved her the same way he loved Margot or not. Menabar does nothing to ease her pain, just an eerie smile. Eve storms upstairs to her room and Menabar rips up the papers and throws them in the crackling flames by the fireplace. At night, Eve jolts out of bed due to feeling some unknown presence in the dark. She is convinced someone is staring at her. Loud banging and scratching noises emerge from all directions, forcing Eve to lock herself in a room across the hall. The corridors seem miles long, as Eve runs from one room to another. Petrified, she dials the landline to get into contact with Tom, but his phone is unreachable. The doorknob twists violently, and the door flings open with great force. Eve screams on the top of her lungs before crying her eyes out, and runs down the stairs outside the house, falling on her way down. Eve is mentally and emotionally exhausted and in severe distress. As she turns to run towards the road, Tom emerges and comforts his crying wife. Eve starts bawling in front of Tom, telling him how the doors are starting to open on their own and also mentions the banging noises. To her surprise, Tom is infuriated. He shoves her before punching a wall and goes up the stairs, leaving Eve all by herself crying. Later, Tom apologizes as he thought that Eve was playing a disgusting prank on him. This is exactly how Margot's manic episodes would take place. But Eve reassures him that she is not crazy and what she saw was real, very real. She asks Tom to get rid of this wretched place he calls home and to go back to wherever they came from. Tom tries to make Eve understand that due to the intricacies of the state's inheritance law, if he buys a house somewhere else, he will lose all investment. But he tells Eve not to worry, as he is working on something and will give her some good news very soon. Tom kisses Eve and tells her that he has taken the day off tomorrow, and that they will spend the following day out on the water, enjoying some time alone. The next day, Tom and Eve are on the water. Eve looks distraught. She refuses to eat the food they have brought and just sits, staring into space. All of a sudden, she notices Alice and Mrs. Gummerby staring at them from the lake's bridge. She becomes increasingly insecure and tells Tom. He asks her to let it go. When he is looking elsewhere, Eve throws the food into the water before Tom turns the boat to get back to shore. At home, Eve has a conversation with Mrs. Menabar, telling her how the townsfolk stared at the couple when they were out on the boat. Mrs. Menabar then gives Eve the shocking information that the boat belonged to Margot, and that it was taken out of storage after several years. Eve begins questioning whether Tom is the one who is slowly poisoning her in accordance with the book. She commands Mrs. Menabar to show her a picture of Margot Blake. Menabar refuses outright, saying all pictures have either been burnt or lost. Desperate, Eve goes to Alice for help. Alice, after some convincing, shows Eve the wedding photographer of Tom Stewart and Margot Blake. The picture scares the living life out of Eve, as it is the picture of Mrs. Menabar, the friendly house help who only comes during the day and interacts with nobody but her. She tells Alice that this is Menabar, but Alice tells her that it's been long since Menabar has perished, and that the woman in the photo is Margot, not Menabar. Slowly but surely, all the gears start falling into place for Eve. She was never crazy to begin with. She was being fed a poison which forced her into a psychosis. The tea-friendly Mrs. Menabar gave her. That was the first time she drank her own poison with her own hands. The package Sanders left on the table. Those were the ingredients. And finally, the conversation they were having in the attic. It was about Tom planning to sell the house due to a loophole he found and Sanders persuading him not to. Mrs. Menabar was never there. Margot, however, was. She was there every minute since every day Eve moved into this cursed house. She was the one who choked Wendy, not the dessert. She was the one who opened the door that night, not poor old Bully. Eve rushes home. She finds Sanders barging and shouting for Tom not to sell the house as she would be very angry. He repeatedly insists that she, referring to Margot, needs this house to survive, she needs Tom to survive, that she is deceased but not gone. Sanders takes off, leaving Eve even more terrified than she was to begin with. Eve starts contemplating what actually is going on. Tom arrives with a smile on his face to tell Eve the big news that the house has been sold, but Sanders corners him and berates him for betraying Margot's soul. He tells her he loved Margot more than Tom ever could, and that Tom relayed Margot's unwavering love by marrying some young girl a few years after she passed. In a fit of impending rage, Sanders pulls out a gun. Eve arrives and shouts at Sanders to let Tom go. Both the men get into an armed tussle, and the gun ends up accidentally firing, fatally wounding Tom. Margot stares from the attic, roaring in despair over losing Tom. Sanders, ashamed that he has failed Margot, commits leaving only Eve to mourn. Eve is admitted to a mental asylum, where it is revealed that she is pregnant. She takes a few days to recover before going back home, only to find the house in ruin and Bully running across the broken furniture. She calls out for Tom but receives no response. Her hallucination finally fades when she realizes that her husband is gone. She finds Margot sitting by the broken furniture in a white gown, mourning the loss of the love of her life. Margot holds Eve up, almost choking her lifeless. Eve convinces Margot that they can still have a piece of Tom together with them as she's pregnant with Tom's child. She tells her that Margot and Tom are the closest family she has had for a long time. She is more than willing for Margot to be a part of the family that she and Tom imagined together. A few years later, Tom's toddler son is seen, having been collectively raised by Eve and Margot. The movie fades to black as Tom's son plays in the yard with Eve sitting on the benches and Margot watching from the attic afar.